One night he was a prophet on stage, a genius channeling music beyond language. The next morning he was another overdose statistic. Tim Buckley's seven-octave gift had burned itself out. June 29, 1975. Venice Beach, California. The pale amber light of dawn filtered through cheap apartment curtains, the kind of light that promises redemption but delivers only cruel clarity. On a worn couch in a room cluttered with guitar cases and empty bottles lay Timothy Charles Buckley III, 28 years old, motionless, a discarded syringe on the floor. His friend Richard Keeling, still foggy from the heroin they'd shared hours earlier, realized something was wrong. By the time paramedics arrived at 9:42 a.m., the voice that had lifted audiences into ecstasy the night before had fallen silent forever. Acute heroin morphine intoxication. The official cause of death was clinical, mundane, depressingly familiar in the music world of the 1970s. Another talented musician felled by drugs. Another obituary in the back pages. But those who'd been at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium the night before knew this was different. Tim had just delivered what witnesses called the performance of his life, a voice that could whisper like a lover and wail like a wounded god, navigating impossible registers with the ease of a man who'd finally made peace with his gift. Critics who'd written him off came backstage to apologize, to say this was the comeback. The audience had risen to their feet in thunderous applause. Tim had smiled, accepted the praise, then disappeared into the California night. Less than 12 hours later, he was dead. The voice that could bend sound itself, that could hit notes human vocal cords weren't designed to reach, that could make audiences weep or recoil or sit in stunned silence. That voice was gone. And the question that would haunt everyone who knew him was simple and terrible. Had Tim Buckley died by accident, or had he been dying all along, burning himself down note by note, album by album, choice by choice, until nothing remained but ash and the ghost of a melody? The world hadn't known what to do with him when he was alive. Too experimental for folk, too pure for pop, too avant-garde for jazz, too intellectual for rock. He refused to belong to any genre, any audience, any expectation. Music is freedom. The business is prison. He'd said that more than once, and he'd meant it absolutely. Tim Buckley had spent his entire career choosing artistic freedom over commercial survival, purity over compromise, the voice over everything else, family, fame, comfort, safety. And now, in a Venice Beach apartment bathed in morning light, that choice had reached its inevitable conclusion. But to understand how a voice that transcendent could end in such ordinary tragedy, we have to go back to where it all began. To a working-class Irish Catholic household where a sensitive boy discovered that music was the only language that could express what he felt but couldn't say. February 14, 1947. Valentine's Day, Washington, D.C. Timothy Charles Buckley III was born into a world still recovering from war, into a family that valued duty, discipline, and not showing weakness. His father, Tim Buckley Sr., was a decorated World War II veteran who'd seen combat and come home determined to build a normal American life. He wanted a son who played sports, respected authority, followed the rules. What he got was Timothy, bright, sensitive, dreamy, a child who seemed to exist slightly out of phase with everyone around him. Tim's mother, Elaine, recognized something in her son that both fascinated and frightened her. An intensity, a restlessness. He wasn't like other children. At 5 years old, he'd sit for hours listening to records, not children's songs, but jazz, blues, folk, his face transfixed, his emotional responses unnervingly sophisticated. When other boys played games, Tim sat alone humming complicated harmonies, his mind already working in patterns that seemed almost alien. Elaine worried he'd never fit in, never find peace. She was right to worry. The family moved constantly, New York, then California, following Tim Sr.'s construction work. By Tim's teenage years, they'd settled in Anaheim, in the shadow of Disneyland's manufactured happiness. The Buckley household was traditional, Catholic, working class. Tim Sr. drank steadily, if not heavily. Elaine managed the home with quiet anxiety. And young Timothy learned that his internal life, the music in his head, the emotions that overwhelmed him, was something to hide from his father, who had no patience for sensitivity in a son. At 13, Tim picked up a guitar. Within weeks, he was writing songs that didn't sound like anything on the radio. Not teenage angst, but something stranger, darker. Songs about death and transcendence and beauty so intense it approached violence. His high school teachers didn't know what to make of him. He was handsome, popular, captain of the football team. He dated a sweet girl named Mary Guibert. He seemed normal. But those who got close sensed the disconnect. Tim was performing normalcy, but his real life happened alone in his room, guitar in hand, voice exploring impossible registers. By 16, he was playing Orange County coffee houses, and the reaction was immediate and uncomfortable. Audiences would fall silent mid-conversation, stunned by this kid who sang like an angel with secrets. Club owners didn't know how to market him. He looked like a folk singer but sounded like something that belonged in an opera house or a cathedral or a fever dream. Other young musicians, including bass player Jim Fielder, who'd later join Blood, Sweat and Tears, recognized immediately that Tim wasn't just talented. He was dangerous in the way only true artists are dangerous, willing to sacrifice everything for a vision most people couldn't even perceive. The signs of future tragedy were already visible. Tim's relationship with his father was distant, transactional. He learned that love was conditional based on meeting expectations he had no interest in meeting. His mother's anxiety taught him that his gift was also a burden, and the relentlessly sunny California landscape gave him nothing authentic to push against. He had to create his own darkness, excavate his own depths in a world that offered only surfaces. The voice was already there, enormous and otherworldly. But so was the curse. A sensitivity so acute that ordinary life felt like a betrayal of his true nature. At 18, Tim made two decisions that would define and destroy his life. First, he married Mary Guibert in a Catholic ceremony that satisfied their families but doomed a relationship between two fundamentally incompatible people. Mary was grounded, practical, dreaming of stability and children. Tim was already halfway gone, chasing a vision that had no room for domestic life. When Mary became pregnant in late 1965, Tim's reaction was panic, not joy. A child meant staying put, accepting the conventional path. He couldn't do it. When Jeff Scott Buckley was born on November 17, 1966, Tim held his son once, maybe twice, then left for Los Angeles to pursue the music career that mattered more than fatherhood. The second decision was forming the Bohemians with poet-lyricist Larry Beckett. Larry was everything Tim needed. Literary, intellectual, willing to write surreal, imagistic lyrics that matched Tim's increasingly experimental compositions. While other bands chased radio hits, Tim and Larry were creating Baroque mini-operas about medieval knights and doomed lovers and existential dread. It was uncommercial, uncompromising, utterly Tim. Years later, when confronted about abandoning his child, Tim offered no real excuse, just a statement that revealed everything about his priorities. I couldn't be two things at once. That choice, music over family, art over responsibility, wasn't just selfish. It was the first clear indication of a pattern that would ultimately destroy him. Tim Buckley's curse wasn't his voice. It was his absolute inability to compromise, to accept that you could be an artist and a father, that genius didn't require sacrificing everything human at the altar of art. But Tim didn't see it that way. For him, there was only the music, the voice, the vision. Everything else was distraction, chains, prison. He chose freedom. And every day until his death, he'd pay the price for that choice. Los Angeles in 1966 was the perfect place for Tim Buckley to catch fire. The folk rock scene was exploding. The troubadour was the center of the universe. Tim, with his movie star looks and that impossible voice, was noticed immediately. He opened for Jackson Browne, Linda Ronstadt, other rising singer-songwriters. But when Tim took the stage, something happened. Conversations stopped. People leaned forward. That voice didn't just sing, it channeled something beyond words, beyond melody. Some audiences found it transcendent. Others found it unsettling. Nobody found it boring. Herb Cohen, a streetwise manager with industry connections, saw Tim perform and recognized both potential and danger. This kid could be huge, but he was stubborn, uncompromising in ways that would make him difficult to market. Cohen got him signed to Elektra Records, the same label as The Doors, and paired him with producer Paul Rothchild. Tim's self-titled debut album was recorded quickly and released in 1967. It was a solid folk rock album that showcased his voice but not yet his experimental ambitions. Critics praised it. It sold modestly. Tim hated it almost immediately. Why? Because it wasn't him, or wasn't yet what he wanted to become. The album was safe, designed to position him as the next big folk troubadour. But Tim had already moved on in his head. He was listening to John Coltrane, Miles Davis, avant-garde composers. He wanted to do with his voice what Coltrane did with the saxophone, push it beyond melody into pure emotion, pure sound. The success he'd dreamed of was within reach, but it meant continuing down a path he'd already rejected internally. So he made the choice that would define his career, follow his vision, even if it meant alienating the audience he'd just begun to build. His second album, Goodbye and Hello, released in October 1967, was his commercial peak. Ambitious, baroque, showcasing his expanding range and Larry Beckett's surreal lyrics. Songs like Morning Glory and the epic title track demonstrated his ability to navigate complex arrangements and emotional extremes. The album sold well. Critics called him a genius. He was invited on television, positioned as one of the bright young stars alongside Joni Mitchell and Leonard Cohen. For most 20-year-old musicians, this would have been the dream realized. For Tim, it was a trap. He hated the image, the sensitive troubadour, the poet with a guitar. He hated playing the same songs every night. Most of all, he hated the audience's expectations. They wanted pretty folk songs. Tim was already hearing something else entirely. Jazz improvisations, dissonant harmonies, vocal techniques that had nothing to do with folk music. The performances became battlegrounds. He'd start with crowd pleasers, then launch into 20-minute improvisations that left audiences confused, frustrated, sometimes angry. Club owners complained. His manager begged him to play the hits. Tim refused. Music is freedom. The business is prison. He'd chosen freedom, and he meant it absolutely. His next album, Happy Sad, released in April 1969, was a radical departure. Loose, jazzy, almost entirely improvised. It was beautiful, haunting, completely uncommercial. It sold poorly. Critics divided. But Tim was ecstatic. For the first time, he'd made the album he heard in his head. The consequences were immediate. Smaller crowds, radio silence, the folk rock audience moving on. And his personal life spiraled, drinking heavily, experimenting with drugs, burning through relationships. The distance from Mary and Jeff gnawed at him, but not enough to bring him back. He sent money occasionally, called rarely. He'd made his choice, the voice over everything else. Was this artistic courage or self-destruction? Even Tim didn't seem to know. His letters to Larry Beckett from this period reveal a man simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. He wrote about wanting to leave the body through the voice, to achieve transcendence through sound. But he also wrote about feeling like a fraud, wondering if his experiments were genius or just noise that alienated the few people who'd cared. The loneliness was crushing. He had collaborators, lovers, admirers, but no one who truly understood him. He'd spend nights after failed performances alone in hotel rooms, drinking, listening to Coltrane, trying to decode the secret of how to make uncompromising music that was also heard. Then came Star Sailor. Released in November 1970, it remains one of the most polarizing albums in rock history. Tim assembled jazz musicians and essentially told them to forget everything they knew about how music should work. He sang in glossolalia, ululated, whispered, screamed. He used his voice as a purely percussive instrument divorced from meaning or melody. Some tracks didn't have lyrics so much as vocalized textures, sounds from somewhere pre-verbal, pre-rational. The album cover, Tim's face fragmented by prisms, perfectly captured the music's shattering of identity and form. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Brilliance? Madness? The outer limit of vocal possibility, or self-indulgent nonsense? Star Sailor sold fewer than 3,000 copies in its first year. Elektra dropped Tim from the label. Radio wouldn't touch it. Even his most loyal fans found it impenetrable. Club owners refused to book him. At 24, Tim Buckley was finished as a recording artist. No label, no audience. The voice that could navigate 7 octaves had been perfected but rendered obsolete. The industry's verdict was clear. Too weird, too uncompromising, too willing to choose artistic purity over survival. Behind all that artistic ambition, was there an unbearable loneliness nobody saw? Absolutely. Tim's brilliance had isolated him completely. He'd alienated the folk audience, confused the jazz audience, and created something too experimental for commercial radio. He'd achieved exactly what he wanted, total artistic freedom, and discovered it meant performing to empty rooms, watching his records gather dust in bargain bins, realizing that purity without audience is just shouting into the void. The triumph of Star Sailor was also its tragedy. Tim had finally made the album that existed only in his head, and the world had responded with silence. The years from 1971 to 1974 were Tim Buckley's wilderness, desperate, scrambling for relevance and money. Without a record deal, he survived on sporadic club gigs, sometimes playing to audiences of a dozen people. The voice remained magnificent, but without context or audience, it felt wasted. He moved around Los Angeles, crashing with friends, drinking heavily, dabbling in heroin and cocaine. His appearance changed. The fresh-faced troubadour replaced by a harder, more haggard figure. Long hair, mustache, exhaustion worn like a costume. Then came the most painful compromise of his career. Desperate for commercial success, Tim abandoned the avant-garde and pivoted toward funk and R&B. He signed with Frank Zappa's label and released Greetings from L.A. in 1972. Sexually explicit funk songs calculated to shock audiences into paying attention. Songs like Get on Top were designed to provoke. Critics dismissed it as desperate. Former fans felt betrayed. Tim claimed he was being honest, exploring new territory. But the desperation was obvious. This wasn't evolution. It was a drowning man grabbing anything that might keep him afloat. The funk period produced 3 albums: Greetings from L.A., Sophronia, 1973, and Look at the Fool, 1974. Each progressively more hollow, more calculated. There were moments of beauty, flashes of the old Tim, but mostly they felt like work from a man imitating himself, trying to remember what it felt like to believe in his music. The album sold poorly. The funk audience didn't want a white folk singer appropriating black music. The folk audience had moved on. Tim was stranded in no man's land, too talented to quit, too stubborn to compromise effectively, too broken to find a way forward. His drug use intensified. Friends disagree about severity. Some insist recreational use, others saw a man numbing the pain of obsolescence. In interviews from this period, Tim oscillates between defiance and despair. He'd say, "I made the music I wanted. If people didn't get it, that's not my problem." But his eyes told a different story. haunted by whether his uncompromising vision had been worth the cost of everything else. The transformation in Tim's psychology was profound. The confident genius of the late 60s gave way to something darker, more fragile. He cycled between manic confidence and crushing self-doubt. He'd rant about audience stupidity, industry cowardice, the mediocrity of successful musicians who'd sold out. Then he'd collapse into silence, drinking alone, questioning whether he'd made terrible mistakes. His friends barely recognized him. The Tim who'd spoken about music as liberation now talked about it as a curse. "My voice is the only part of me that tells the truth," he'd say, suggesting everything else, personality, choices, relationships, was false or broken. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? Tim Buckley couldn't. The failure of Star Sailor, the desperation of the funk albums, the growing isolation, these weren't discrete events but accumulating weight. He'd burned too many bridges. The folk rock world had moved on. The avant-garde audience was too small. The funk experiment had failed. He was stranded, too talented to quit, too stubborn to bend, too broken to see a path forward. The drugs weren't the cause. They were symptoms of a man who'd painted himself into an impossible corner. By early 1975, something shifted. Tim cleaned up, at least partially. He reconciled with old friends. Most importantly, he started writing new material that synthesized everything he'd learned. The melodic accessibility of his early work, the improvisational freedom of his jazz period, the raw energy of funk. Friends who heard these songs were excited. This could be the comeback. At 28, Tim Buckley wasn't finished. The voice was intact. The ambition was returning. Maybe there was still time. He started booking gigs seriously again, engaging with audiences rather than challenging them. The performances were revelatory. Critics who'd written him off came to shows and left stunned. The Santa Monica Civic performance on June 28, 1975 was supposed to be the turning point. Everyone who was there describes it in mystical terms. Tim sang with power and control that made his earlier work seem like warm-up exercises. He connected with the audience, smiled, joked between songs. It felt like a man returning after a long exile. When he left the stage, the applause was thunderous. People were crying. Backstage, friends congratulated him. The comeback was real. Hours later, in Richard Keeling's Venice Beach apartment, Tim accepted heroin. Neither were regular users at that point. The heroin was surprisingly pure. Tim's tolerance, reduced by months of relative sobriety, couldn't handle a dose he would have managed easily a year earlier. By dawn, he was dead. The official narrative, tragic miscalculation by a man who didn't know his limits, had changed. But those who knew Tim wonder if on some level he'd been courting this ending all along. "I'll burn in every song," burning himself down until nothing remained. The funeral was small. Mary Guibert brought 8-year-old Jeff, who didn't fully understand that the stranger being mourned was his father. The music industry barely noticed. A few obituaries, brief radio tributes, no major retrospectives. Tim had been too far outside the mainstream, too commercially unsuccessful. His death was sad but not shocking. Drugs had claimed another musician. The narrative was familiar, almost boring. What made it tragic wasn't lost potential, though at 28 he had decades ahead, but waste. A voice like that, a vision like that, and he'd managed to alienate nearly everyone who might have helped. He'd proven you could expand boundaries, do things never done before. He'd also proven it might cost everything. The bargain was clear. Total artistic freedom in exchange for career, family, and ultimately life. Tim had accepted those terms completely and paid in full. The cruel epilogue arrived 21 years later. Jeff Buckley, who'd grown up barely knowing his father, achieved the fame Tim never had with the album Grace. Jeff had inherited the voice, that impossible range and emotional intensity, but learned from Tim's mistakes. He made accessible music without sacrificing integrity. Critics and audiences loved him. He was called the voice of a generation. Then on May 29, 1997, Jeff drowned in the Wolf River in Memphis, 30 years old, just 2 years older than his father at death. The coincidence was unbearable. Father and son, both blessed with transcendent voices, both dead young in senseless tragedies. The Buckley curse was born, not supernatural but simple, terrible arithmetic. Voices that beautiful, sensitivity that acute, couldn't be sustained in bodies that fragile. The intensity required to sing like that eventually consumed the singer. Tim had known this, warned about it, lived it anyway. And Jeff, trying to understand his absent father, had followed the same path to the same end. In death, Tim and Jeff became forever linked. Dream Brother by David Brown became the definitive text, exploring how two men who barely knew each other shared not just a voice, but a fate. The tragedy was no longer just Tim's. It became about legacy, inheritance, whether genius is inseparable from self-destruction. Jeff had spent his life trying to understand why Tim chose music over family. Then Jeff made similar choices, prioritizing art above safety, above longevity, above everything. Tim Buckley's influence is now acknowledged as foundational to experimental rock. Musicians from Robert Plant to Tom York cite him as influence, praising his willingness to risk everything for vision. Star Sailor, once dismissed as unlistenable, is now considered a masterpiece, a landmark of vocal experimentation. The early albums have been reissued multiple times. Tim Buckley tribute concerts still happen. He's become what he never was in life, a legend, an icon of artistic purity. But the lesson isn't about purity. It's about cost. Here was a man so talented, so visionary, he couldn't exist in the world as it was. He needed reality to bend to his vision, and when it didn't, he broke himself against it. Was he right to refuse compromise? Did his uncompromising approach give us music we never would have heard otherwise? Or did Tim waste his gifts through stubbornness, achieving a fraction of what he might have if he'd been willing to meet audiences halfway? Both are true. Tim gave us extraordinary music precisely because he wouldn't compromise, and he destroyed himself for the same reason. The voice that could navigate 7 octaves, that could whisper like a lover and wail like a prophet, sang for only 28 years. But it sang truths that still resonate, challenged conventions that still need challenging, reached for heights that still inspire awe. Tim Buckley didn't ask to be understood. He didn't ask to be forgiven for choosing art over his son, purity over survival, the voice over life itself. He only asked that you listen, really listen, to what his voice was trying to say. And if you do, if you sit in a quiet room with Star Sailor or Happy Sad or those early folk albums, you'll hear something beyond music. You'll hear a man trying to escape mortality through sound alone. Ambition so pure it becomes painful. Beauty so intense it approaches violence. You'll hear the cost of refusing every compromise, the price of total artistic freedom. You'll hear genius burning itself out in real time. Tim Buckley chose freedom in music and discovered too late that freedom meant burning everything, even himself. Music is freedom. The business is prison. He'd said it like a mantra, lived it like religion, and died proving it true. 45 years after that Venice Beach dawn, we're still asking whether it was worth it. The music can't answer. It can only testify to what was, a voice unlike any other, a vision so pure it couldn't survive contact with reality. A man who chose to burn bright rather than fade slow. If to keep the purity of art you must destroy career and family. Is that genius or just a form of suicide? Tim Buckley never answered that question directly, but his life was the answer. He proved you could expand boundaries, sing notes human voices weren't designed to hit, create music that transcended genre and language. He also proved it might cost everything: marriage, fatherhood, career, life. That's the bargain for artists who refuse any compromise. Tim accepted those terms completely, lived them absolutely, paid the price without complaint. Whether that makes him hero or cautionary tale depends on what you value, the art that survives or the artist who doesn't. And the question that haunts us still: can a voice be legacy, or is it also a curse? Tim Buckley died young. Jeff Buckley died young. Both possessed gifts that seemed almost supernatural, voices that could do things normal voices couldn't. Both prioritized that gift above everything else. Both died in accidents that felt less like bad luck and more like inevitability, as if voices that beautiful couldn't be sustained in bodies that fragile, as if the intensity required to sing like that eventually consumed the singer. The Buckley curse isn't mystical. It's the arithmetic of genius. The brighter you burn, the faster you consume yourself. The morning after that triumphant Santa Monica Civic performance, the music world woke to news of another overdose, another talented musician gone, another statistic. But those who'd been there the night before, who'd watched Tim Buckley command that stage, his voice reaching impossible registers, his performance suggesting a man reborn, they knew something different. They'd witnessed not a comeback, but a farewell. The prophet channeling music beyond language had delivered his final sermon. By dawn, he was gone. The voice that tried to sing its way out of the human condition fell silent on a Venice beach couch. But voices like that don't really die. They echo, they haunt, they inspire and terrify in equal measure. Every young musician who decides to risk everything for art is following Tim's example. Every artist who refuses compromise, who insists on vision despite consequences, is Tim's heir. He proved boundaries could be expanded, that music could go places it had never been. He also proved the cost might be everything. Tim Buckley spent 28 years trying to free his voice from the prison of convention, commerce, and expectation. He succeeded brilliantly, and it killed him. That's the truth nobody wants to acknowledge. Sometimes artistic freedom and human survival are incompatible. Sometimes the only way to achieve the purity of vision is to sacrifice the life that contains it. Tim understood this, maybe from the very beginning. He told a friend once near the end, "I'll burn in every song." It wasn't metaphor, it was prophecy, it was choice. It was the only way Tim Buckley knew how to live and die.